Thank you, and welcome to the first day and first event of the UK presidency of the Financial Action Task Force. The UK presidency has three focus priorities for the next 2 years, based on what we believe will be the most effective actions to improve the effectiveness of our global AML CTF regimes and deliver the most real-world impact in combating money laundering and terrorist financing. Those are going to be fraud, improving the implementation of the risk-based approach, and improving the sharing of information to tackle financial crime. FATF has traditionally focused on a follow-the-money approach and not on the predicate offences behind money laundering. So why are we choosing to prioritise fraud amongst all the threats we face? And why are we doing this event on day one of a new presidency? Firstly, the scale of the threat from fraud costs $500 billion a year across the world. It's the predominant predicate offence in 90% of the FATF mutual evaluations done across the global network in our last round. Secondly, the impact of fraud. That's the impact not only on victims of fraud who lose their life savings and suffer untold emotional harm, but also the people who can be trafficked into working in scam compounds, who can be held in conditions of modern slavery and forced labour and suffer deeply as a result. And fraud is increasingly an issue that threatens not just financial stability, but also financial inclusion, and is a national security threat for many of our members. Thirdly, the nature of fraud makes it different to other predicate offences that FATF is designed to help counter. The laundering of the proceeds of fraud are most often intertwined with the commission of the predicate offence, the commission of fraud, to a far greater extent than in many other predicates. Fourth and finally, the urgency of the challenge here. FATF's keenly aware of the growing calls for international leadership to combat fraud. We recognise that the FATF is not going to be the entire solution at a global level to the current challenge, but we think we can be a much bigger part of the solution through the global network that we have, who are mobilised and ready to join forces to combat fraud, and through our standards that can help tackle fraud, and through the strong partnership we have with many of the organisations present on the call today and who will be speaking later. So the FATF work on fraud starts today with the launch of this roadmap. We want to move rapidly from analysis of the global problem of fraud, the best practices that are taking place around the world to combat it, move rapidly on to recommendations for how FATF can better respond using our toolkit. And as the shape of today's event shows, we want to focus in particular on the role of financial intelligence, information sharing, and asset recovery as particularly important areas to focus on. In parallel, we also want to identify where existing anti-scam work, anti-scam models can be scaled up and linked across borders, supporting more widespread use of information sharing and partnership models around the world. FATF members have also highlighted the critical importance of closing the gaps in the implementation of FATF standards on regulation and supervision of virtual assets, and their role in tackling fraud, given their prevalence in both the commission and the laundering of fraud. We also know the importance of the technology, social media, and telecommunications sectors, and the role we have to engage with them, as they have much of the intelligence and many of the levers to prevent and disrupt fraud at the scale that we need to. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we're committed to using the strongest levers that the FATF already has, our assessment and follow-up processes, to increase both the pressure but also support that we offer members to tackle fraud and the threat it presents to both them and the global system. So, to today's event. Firstly, thank you for the massively positive response we've had from the speakers and the audience. This really gives us a strong sense of buy-in and engagement with our work, but also we know comes with expectations about what the FATF can deliver. We take that very seriously and are committed to trying to work with you all to build synergies and linkages between our work, to complement each other's activities to combat fraud, and to try and collectively maximise the concrete output and results and outcomes that we generate from those. And the aim of this event is in good part to try and illustrate the breadth of the range of stakeholders that we want to partner with and work with today. So the guiding tone, the guiding question underneath all of that we'll discuss in the next couple of hours is going to be, how do we move from a situation of largely reacting to trying to prevent fraud at scale, recover stolen funds and return them to their victims? So on that note, I will pass over to Violaine and Shana from the FATF Secretariat to set the scene on what already exists and where we're going next. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles, and thank you, Monsieur le Président. So let me start with a quick overview for those who may not be familiar with the FATF. The Financial Action Task Force, as some of you know, is a global standard setter for tackling illicit finance. And our standards are implemented by over 200 jurisdictions across our global network. What makes the FATF unique is that we don't just look at laws on paper, but we assess whether countries are actually effective in fighting financial crime through a peer review process. We also continuously monitor emerging risks to stay ahead of threats, which is one of the reasons we are here today. This work is supported by 9 regional bodies, some of them will take the floor today, and more than 20 partner organizations around the world, and they are also represented in this event. So many stakeholders are asking the FATF to do more on fraud. And the good news is we already have a strong toolkit that can be leveraged and we'll do more. Could you put the slide on screen, please? Thank you. So let me highlight a few key elements that are reflected on screen. First of all, payment transparency. It helps improve the traceability of transaction and visibility of payment chain for easier and faster detection and disruption of illicit transaction, including fraud. We've recently updated this standard, and we are consulting currently on guidelines, including how to better address fraud risks. Second, regulation of virtual assets aims to close gaps across countries and limit the misuse of crypto assets in fraud schemes. Third, asset recovery tools enable faster freezing and confiscation of criminal proceeds, including in some cases without a prior conviction, and strengthen international cooperation. Beneficial ownership transparency is also critical. Let me move to partnership. Partnership, both domestically and internationally, are key. Better cooperation between public authorities and with the private sector significantly improves detection and disruption. National anti-fraud centers share many of these attributes, powers, and constituents of national AML coordination center regime. So effective interagency cooperation across borders can significantly enhance the detection, disruption, and investigation of transnational fraud and scam networks. Finally, technology. Technology is, of course, also part of the solution. Many financial intelligence units and banks are already using AI and data analytics to detect suspicious activities and anomalies associated with fraud. Linked to technology, FATF digital IDs guidance help manage risk linked to use of false identity in an increasingly complex digital environment. So just to conclude before giving the floor to Shana, we also have done significant work with partners like Interpol, Egmont on cyber-enabled crime. And the idea with this fraud roadmap is to continue to partner with our huge network of observers. So in short, the FATF already has a solid foundation to tackle fraud, and we are now accelerating our efforts to adapt it to today's challenges. Today is the beginning of that journey. I hand over to Shana. Thank you.
Thank you, Violaine. And so for those of you who don't know the FATF, we operate by having 3 meetings a year, which is where the FATF members take decisions at what we call our plenary, and they happen in February, June, and October. So I just want to tell you a little bit about our timelines for delivering on this work moving forward. First, as we're starting on today, we're bringing together the right stakeholders to make sure that we complement and not duplicate existing efforts. Second, from now until October, our primary focus will be on scam compounds, building on all the work that's already been done by the UN, Interpol, APG, and ACAMS, who you'll hear from later today. And our goal really is to move quickly from admiring the problem to identifying how detection and disruption techniques work, the gaps, and the potential actions that we need to take. After October, by February 2027, we will continue to work more broadly on cyber-enabled fraud to deliver a clear picture of good practices, the the gaps more generally, and the priority actions moving forward. And from February 2027 until the end of the UK presidency, June 2028, the focus will really shift on implementing those actions as best we can. So this is an ambitious timeline, and the success really depends on strong collaboration with all the stakeholders represented today, and many more that we couldn't fit into this agenda. And we really want to achieve concrete outcomes that's going to make a difference for the benefit of the victims. So with that, I'm going to start by handing over to Giles for panel one, and I'll ask all the panelists on panel one to turn on their videos. Over to you, Giles.
Great, thank you, Shana. So the first panel on rethinking financial intelligence is designed to look at the critical role of financial intelligence in combating fraud and whether we need to rethink the traditional AML model for the production, reporting and use of financial intelligence in order to better deal with the speed and scale of fraud and give us the tools to disrupt it better. So you've got the full details of our speakers in the material you would have seen, but I'm delighted to have Brendan from Australia, Bello from Nigeria, Oromoni from Thailand, and Mark from the UK on the panel. And this is going to be quite a quick fire panel in the interest of time, but I'm going to ask to all the speakers in order our first question, which is to ask them what are the key initiatives that they're making within their jurisdictions that are delivering a real difference in their ability to use financial and other intelligence to fight fraud, and what they think the FATF can do to help scale this internationally. And if I can go first to Oromoni to answer that first question, please.
Hi, thank you. I think for Thailand, the most important step is the legislation on cyber fraud that enable whole of country approach to combat fraud, whereby all relevant parties are involved from all sectors like telco, social media platform, banks, payment, digital asset, etc., and from all relevant authorities as well, from regulators, police, government, and role of each parties are clearly defined. Information sharing is allowed, and incentive and disincentives are clearly specified, which is the shared responsibility framework. But with the legislation, with the number that we have, it shows that we have to move from reacting to preventing, because from the minute that the victim transfer the money, in 3 minutes, 50% of the losses already gone out of the country. And normally about 20 hours that the victim would be aware that they are actually have already been scammed. So we have to move to prevention. And that's where AI is the key to move forward in our country.
Thank you, Oromoni. And if I could put the same question to Bello now, please. You're on mute, Bello, sorry.
Okay, can you hear me now? Thank you very much. So for us, the Nigerian law enforcement has significantly ramped up efforts to combat scams and fraud through a multi-agency approach. Its successes are really intelligence-led and can be attributed to increased financial intelligence passed by the NFIU to law enforcement agencies. This effort spans high-profile arrest and record conviction. We have arrested over 792 persons, and out of that, we have about 192 foreigners operating scam centers out of Lagos. This includes asset recovery, cross-border operations, and technical cyber threat mitigation. To put it in this context, the Nigerian government has placed the fight against scams and fraud at the apex of political agenda. And we have treated it as a non-negotiable national security imperative that commands the highest executive attention and interagency coordination. This top-tier political commitment has galvanized our law enforcement through a unified multi-agency architecture. So we have established a joint case team on cybercrime, which is coordinated under national security and operating under the Ministry of Justice, which equally brings together investigators, prosecutors, and judges to handle online fraud cases. Other areas of those initiatives include information sharing of threat intelligence with the FIU. We feel the convergence of fraud intelligence and traditional financial intelligence can be improved significantly with cyber threat intelligence. Again, international cooperation, we have demonstrated that with leveraging on bilateral agreements we have with especially the United Kingdom in establishing a joint fraud action focusing on intelligence sharing, capacity building, and equally public awareness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bello. And Mark, if I could turn to you next, please.
Thank you, Giles. So what's making a difference in the UK and elsewhere in other jurisdictions? The establishment of anti-scam centres or anti-fraud centres. There are a number of national responses around the globe. As you kind of outlined at the start, the fraud threat has evolved at scale and pace. Financial intelligence is now more operational and real time. And that sits in kind of signals, bank accounts, mule bank accounts, and cross-sector data. The benefit of these anti-scam centres is they're often co-located, they're multi-agency, and they're built on public-private partnerships that collapse the time between detection and action. In the UK, we have a 10-year history of public-private partnerships, firstly created working closely with the financial sector to share intelligence and inform each other's risk matrices. And we recently announced in the UK fraud strategy, the online crime command that builds on this public-private model, includes wider policing, security services, but crucially key industry sectors, including finance, telecom, big tech, insurance, and crypto. And it's a means to convene different sectors to unite data, expertise, and operational capability. I guess the response to the second part, how can FATF help to scale this internationally? I think there's space for FATF to facilitate peer-to-peer learning on those public-private partnership models, potential to credit the establishment of anti-scam centres models in mutual evaluations. I think it comes back to that data sharing point, looking at the kind of issuing of guidance for cross-sector data sharing across, including telco, tech, and the financial sector.
Thank you very much, Mark. And finally, for this round of questions, to Brendan, please.
Yeah, thanks, Giles. One of the strongest things we have in Australia is our public-private partnership. As Mark just said, we've had one also for 10 years, built from an AML perspective, but now being used for a whole range of other things. And it's incredibly strong. It doesn't just involve the banking sector, but it involves gambling, digital currency businesses, and other payment platforms. And what we're seeing is that public-private partnership is able to analyse data and insights across entire financial systems. We've been able to use the powers that we have through the AML legislation in Australia to get large data sets from multiple industry types, analyse them relatively quickly, understand frauds that we might not otherwise see, the dynamics of frauds and the movement of money in ways that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do, and bring expertise from the private sector into the FIU to be able to add to the value of the intelligence that we've been able to get. What we've also been able to do recently in Australia is to try and use our AML regulatory powers to design controls that match the risks that we see and the flows of funds that we see, to try and impose controls on those channels where we see the proceeds of frauds flowing. For example, we've done that last year around digital currency exchanges, where we saw large-scale fast flows of digital currency out of Australia and into scam centres in other countries. We were able to design AML controls and apply those controls across multiple businesses simultaneously to try and then lift the control environment across the entire sector, rather than doing it business by business. In terms of what the FATF network could do, there's a number of things. One is information sharing, as you said earlier, is key to this. We still have challenges being able to share information quickly across borders, and particularly from the private sector to the public sector across borders. If we could fix that, we'd be in a much stronger position. Secondly, I think we could share active AML controls that can be used to control the flow of fraud proceeds through high-risk channels. And thirdly, globally, we've built a very strong network of financial intelligence units. And there's a lot of scope for us to start to think about how we can get those financial intelligence units to operate faster in a more agile way on a much more regionalised basis. So we can start to analyse larger data sets together and understand system-wide operations of frauds, identify syndicates and other key linkages globally, and be able to target those more effectively.
Thank you, Brendan. And I mean, a lot of really great examples from the speakers of how they're using AML tools, but going a lot further and using them in new and different ways to combat fraud. And if I can stay with Brendan for the next question, a lot of the initiatives described by yourself, but also the other speakers, also went in some ways beyond what we in FATF would call the traditional suspicious transaction reporting system, to use a wider variety of financial intelligence and in a different way. To what extent, from your experience, do you think we need to contemplate a new or different system for financial intelligence when it comes to fraud?
Yeah, we really do. I mean, the suspicious transaction system is quite valuable and helps us in money laundering investigations enormously, but it's about establishing a suspicion, providing intelligence to an FIU, and helping to build pictures of criminality that can go to law enforcement. When we start to deal with scams, it's a different dynamic and a different environment. In frauds are invariably identified either by the financial institution or by a customer contacting the financial institution. The need to establish a suspicion is quite a different level of dynamic. You've established a fraud quite quickly. Secondly, the STR regime is very valuable, but takes time and takes effort. And we need to be able to respond to fraud much more quickly. We also, in 2026, have a lot more tools to be able to analyse and move large data sets more quickly, to be able to apply the growing and powerful innovative technology across those data sets, to be able to act in much more real time. We've got great potential to apply behavioural technology across those data sets where we can start to intervene in much more real time. And we need to be able to see activity across multiple financial institutions simultaneously and be able to respond to that activity across multiple systems simultaneously. And for that, we need a much more dynamic way to share information in much more real time.
Thank you very much. And if I turn next to Mark, and could you talk a little bit more from your UK experience, Mark, about how much of the information, the intelligence you need to combat fraud sits within the traditional AML regulated sector, and where else you've had to go to find the intelligence you need? Mark, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, of course, some in part action with intelligence sits within the AML regulated sector, but of course, the kind of nature of fraud and how fraudsters are accessing potential victims is through telecoms and telco infrastructure. So the earliest kind of signals are from those sectors. The call into the victim, the use of the fake website, the social media ad, and all of that geolocation data, telematics, that sits entirely outside AML obligations at present. There's still a place, obviously, financial institutions still see the money move, but this is post-event after the deception has already occurred. So for us to kind of take action, the most actionable and the quickest way to take action, the intelligence currently sits outside the perimeter of the regulated sector. And it's back to the earlier point of needing to convene cross-sector responses, the need to push public-private and private-to-private cross-sector information sharing. I don't think that the answer is not more obligations on financial institutions.
Thank you, Mark. And turning to Oromoni, could I ask you mentioned the Central Fraud Registry you have in Thailand earlier, which sounds like a great example of the public sector providing a framework for information sharing. Could you tell us how you've made the most of that information, best use of it in Thailand, please?
So our Central Fraud Registry actually have all money trails from the victim to the final exit. So all these information is recorded with the ID and account number. So it's very useful not only to find mules or find criminals, but also to match with the normal data, like the transaction data, account data, where all the banks or payment operators have, to produce models to find potential new moves or potential new victims, and that's been actually very useful in lowering, in decreasing the fraud number in Thailand right now.
Thank you very much. And finally, for this panel, Bella, if I could turn back to you. So I mentioned at the outset in my opening remarks how virtual assets are increasingly seen as both, the currency in which victims are defrauded, but also how scammers are laundering their money. Could you talk about what you've done in Nigeria to try and tackle the use of virtual assets in fraud, and what you think FATF could do more of in this space, please?
Thank you. One of the things we did was to look at regulatory frameworks that needs to be in place so that we can be able to mitigate some of this problem. And we are putting our emphasis on the significant control at the intersect between fiat and virtual currencies. That's from the regulatory aspect, where we believe there's a significant risk. Currently, we are developing a kill chain protocol from the strategic point of view, where we can be able to respond quickly in terms of freezing proceeds of crime, be able to get information that has to do with those kind of transactions. Which, by the way, is a collaborative effort between the public-private sectors and international partners. It focuses on early detection of criminal activities using this class of assets and timely ability to freeze those transactions. And mandate short of travel rules. I know how difficult it is to be able to implement the travel rules, but we feel it's a starting point, and we loop in back on feedback that we get in implementing the travel rules. We are equally exploring the use of central bank digital currency as an alternate way to cash out crypto transactions and virtual asset transactions. And that will equally give us, in terms of visibility and in terms of how we can quickly react to any flags that has to do with such transactions.
Thank you very much, Bello, and thank you to all the panelists for what was some really excellent, both very quick responses, but also really rich with information and ideas and inspiration for us in terms of what countries are doing to tackle fraud and what the FATF could do next. And just to briefly sum up this panel before moving on, I think I took away two big points. One is, I think, the point that Bello made in his initial remarks about needing to get fraud at the top of the political agenda in your country in order to get the buy-in from all the different agencies and departments needed, the right commitment, the right resource. Most of the speakers, I think all of the speakers, mentioned the importance of bringing together different agencies and the private sector in anti-scam centres, and how there's a role for FATF in sharing that best practice, promoting that model as an effective response. I think there was a really key point, which will be in all our panels, I think, about the need for speed in preventing fraud, how the speed at which it's perpetrated and laundered means that you need to be able to act quicker. Great fact from Oromoni about 50% of the proceeds of fraud in Thailand being out of the country in 3 minutes, which I think is a really good stat to bear in mind when you're trying to design a response. And Mark put it very well when talking about you need to collapse the time between detection and prevention if you're to have an impact. And I think that really fed through into some of the responses that we're seeing and where FATF can play a role. The importance of information sharing and public-private partnerships, not just with the traditional regulated sector, but with a broader set of sectors: tech, telco, social media. And then when it comes to financial intelligence, I think the point Brendan made very well about, we actually need to look at a different model. There's a role for the traditional AML model, but you need a model that goes beyond the regulated sector, that can give you large data sets that you can exchange across financial institutions. So the role of private to private information sharing, and that you can increasingly act in real time. And it's only by having that speed and by that information sharing and by that different use of financial intelligence that we're going to be able to move upstream in detecting and preventing and disrupting fraud. So thank you very much to all of the speakers on that first panel. And I'm now going to pass back to Shana to take us on with the next panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Giles. So perfectly on time. Thank you, panel one. Ned, I'm going to hand over to you, Ned Conway, Executive Secretary of the Wolfsburg Group, to start panel two.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shanna, and thanks for allowing us all to be here on the first day of the UK presidency. Very exciting. I'm joined today by Jean-Jacques from Google, Rima from Meta, Jessica from the International Institute of Finance, Justine Walker from ACAMS, and Nick Maxwell from the Future of Financial Intelligence Sharing Initiative. Thanks everyone for attending, and thank you to the audience. We've got 30 minutes, and the first panel has set a good precedent of staying tight and on time, so I'll ask our participants to do the same. Listen, we'll move a little bit fast across the speakers. We'll squeeze out what we can, but I know all of us look forward to collectively developing the themes over the course of the UK presidency under Giles Thompson. Here we're focused on fraud, but certainly we see the application of the risk-based approach and responsible information sharing as key, which were mentioned as the other two priorities. And I'd also like to emphasize what President Thompson noted in his opening remarks and what we heard in the previous panel, which is this main lever that the FATF has in the assessment and follow-up process. With that, I'm going to turn first to Jessica and Justine. Similar to Wolfsburg, your organizations have been focused on private-to-private sector information sharing initiatives with your members, especially those that fall under AML-CFT regulation. So I'll ask you to explain in greater detail some of the initiatives you're working on in a moment. But first, if you could just, given what you're seeing, what you've been doing, what's currently working well in private-to-private information sharing, and what are the real kind of perceived challenges? And Jessica, if you could start us off, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Ned. And actually, I'll probably have even more challenges today than things that are working well. But starting at a high level, there's an enormous will from financial institutions around the world and fraud. Tackling fraud, there is a clear conviction by the C-suite around financial institutions across the globe, and this is on the agenda of the board of directors. So that's quite important. However, they recognize the challenges, and this is where I really want to focus is private-to-private information sharing largely takes place through bilateral agreements between financial institutions today, rather than through a deliberate network of institutions that are designed to facilitate a deliberate anti-fraud capability. Bad actors work in networks, and nothing short of deliberately designed network will combat them here. And that includes both process and content. So in efforts to date, we lack sufficient private-to-private data sharing with non-financial institutions, and I would say the clear incentives to do so. This is particularly important, again, as folks have mentioned before, with telecom, tech, and social media, and private-to-private information sharing just within regulated financial institutions is not going to be able to solve this on its own. We need to work towards some kind of data standard around fraud data sharing, just like we have for standards that require other kinds of data transfer in financial institutions. And then finally, Ned, I'll just say we need constructive engagement with data protection authorities in order to succeed at the content here of doing this, which we often lack today.
Yeah, that's great. And you can already see some of the key themes being pulled out from the previous discussion, the need for clarification, for guidance, for understanding what works, what doesn't. Good to hear, though, about the C-suite buy-in, which is critical. I'm going to pick up on a couple of things you mentioned, and we're lucky to have Jean-Jacques and Rima here as well. But Justine, can you bring us into your perspective, what you're seeing at the ACAMS level, what's working, what are the challenges?
Absolutely. And I really want to echo what we've just heard. Really what we're seeing is very similar. I think on what's good is a real recognition of the issue and challenge. No matter where you are in the world, everybody is identifying scams and cyber-enabled crime as a top threat. And then I would say, secondly, they're identifying how AI-powered identity fraud is really eroding trust and security. So that sort of acknowledgement of the threat has led to many initiatives. And as we've just heard, people are engaging, whether it's fusion centers, anti-scam centers, that's really positive. But it does tend to be fairly jurisdictional focused. And what we're really lacking is that cross-sector and cross-jurisdiction. And this is where we really have the major challenge. And it's really around the siloing of fraud intelligence across sectors and industries. So if you look at the scam, It covers multiple sectors, not just one, but no institution is seeing the whole chain. So we have to really look at ways of how we're going to scale timely intelligence, which is shareable, and people know how to interpret, because different data will work different for different sectors. So in terms of that scaling approach, this is something we've been doing a lot of work around in our International Anti-Fraud and Technology Task Force. And we've got a deep dive paper coming out next week with the Global Anti-Scam Alliance, which is really looking at the barriers here. But I want to pull out one or two of those. And it is really around how comfortable people feel to share intelligence. So as we've just heard, there tends to be a lot of either smaller projects or bilateral sharing. What we don't have is that wider pool of sharing, and we don't have the confidence to share across sectors. So whether it's telecoms to the banks, or the banks to telecoms, or social media, etc. So what we really need to do is address some of those aspects. And the types of concerns that we're seeing, even though that a lot of the information sharing frameworks will have fraud in there in some way or other, it's the intersection of privacy and antitrust and defamation and negligence concerns. This is what's really creating the complexity and legal sort of regulatory uncertainty. So that absolutely has to be addressed. And I just really also want to conclude around the incentives aspects, because we have to create the right incentives. And that really is around the supervisory expectations that reward participation, the trust in the data sets, and an understanding which data sets work best for which sectors and how they can use that, and also mechanisms for smaller institutions or non-financial institutions. So I'll pause there, because I know others will wish to expand on these points.
No, that's great though, and actually that's exactly when I referenced at the top, the importance of the UK presidency embracing the risk-based approach as one of their key pillars, along with information sharing and fraud. To me, I'm very much thinking about resource allocation, prioritization, which goes to your point. These are initiatives that take a lot of investment, and that level of clarity is important. Also, emphasizing what Jessica was saying, key stakeholder here at the data protection universe, right? If we're talking about getting comfortable on information sharing, they're a key partner and can be a key enabler. They're often seen as a blocker, but really they could be an enabler here, which is important. Okay, let's go to Jean-Jacques and Rima. Financial institutions, we're of course highly regulated. We'd like to, complain about that all the time. But in many countries, while there are clear frameworks for information sharing, or there's initiatives to try to clarify that for us, that's not necessarily the case in your universe of tech and social media. Justine just, well mentioned the levels of uncertainties there and sharing kind of cross domain. But there have been advancements in the last several months. Nick Maxwell would call that cross-domain information sharing, text sharing with banks, social media sharing with banks, social media sharing with tech, dogs with cats, cats with dogs, apples with oranges. But let's focus for the moment at a high level on what's working for you guys, what are the challenges, and then we'll get into a moment into the specific initiatives. Jean-Jacques, can you start us off, please? Let's have Jean-Jacques on. Let's go to Rima. Rima, can you kick us
Hear
off?
me now?
Oh, there you go. Yep, you got
Okay.
it. Go for it.
Thanks, Ned. And thanks for having us. Really glad that FATF is joining us in combating scams and fraud. And of course, we've got a very different regulatory framework compared to the financial sector. But perhaps more importantly than a regulatory framework, we have a business imperative in fighting this threat of deceptive practices. Really goes to the heart of having platforms that are trusted by consumers, but also by advertisers and the wider business community. And so this is something that we've been working on over 2 decades now. But what we have seen in recent years is a gradual rise in the problem, very much driven by transnational organized crime really going big into it with extensive financial and technical resources. And so we've had to really ramp up our efforts and our collaborations, because these scam criminals don't know physical or sectoral borders. In fact, that's part of their toolkit. If they want to confuse potential victims and evade detection, they operate offline and online interchangeably. If you think about a scam's journey or kill chain as it's known, they start maybe with a phone call or a text message initially. They might move on to an online messaging platform or an online banking app. And all the while during this journey, this scam skill chain, they exploit a range of financial tools from the very beginning when they're purchasing the infrastructure that they need to operate their crime, all the way to receiving and laundering the funds from victims. So we absolutely need to join forces to avoid siloed approaches, because that's what the scammers are exploiting. And if we wanted to address this issue effectively, then we do need multi-party, cross-sectoral collaboration. And that starts with intelligence sharing, right? We're starting to talk about that. And so it's, for instance, sharing data about exploited assets like compromised bank accounts or fake websites or dodgy exploited websites. And so what have we done so far? Well, in fact, in the tech sector, but hopefully going bigger, we've helped to, as Google, we've helped to create a global platform dedicated to data sharing for scams called the Global Signal Exchange. That was launched in January 2025, just a year and a half ago. But we're already reaping benefits. We've got over 1.3 billion signals, pieces of intelligence that have been exchanged, often in real time, by over 100 organizations, with many of the so-called big tech companies actually on board and law enforcement and government agencies involved. And what does that help us to do is to help us, again, very often in real time, to prevent consumers from accessing compromised resources like compromised websites, and also to help inform the investigations of these criminals by law enforcement. And we're starting to see some very helpful impact on the ground in going after the scammers, including across borders. So it's starting to work really, really well. At the same time,
can I ask, Jean-Jacques? Yeah, it's fantastic that we're moving forward on those signals. What bring me on some of the challenges, and then we'll pick both of those themes up.
So I was getting to that. And so, there's a broader set of things that we do: technological protections, information for users and consumers. All of that is still needed. New prevention techniques. So we get information from financial regulators, for instance, to know which financial organizations are duly approved, and we check that. We do a verification in those high-risk areas to make sure that the advertisers are who they say they are, especially for things like financial services. Now, we need to expand on these emerging areas of progress. And so one of the things we'd be looking at is actually to see more financial institutions as well as telecom companies join existing and working platforms like GSE, because it's working for us, but we're really in dire need of getting other sectors to start sharing much more actively, following on from what's happening with the tech sector already. And so that might involve clarifying legal frameworks to enable wider sharing, for instance, by the financial sector, and encouraging these organizations to more proactively get involved. So, and then taking that from intelligence sharing, we need to really think about disruption and really thinking about how we build the right sort of frictions across the various types of infrastructures, across all these sectors that the scammers are exploiting, and trying to add intelligent friction. So friction that is bad for the bad actors, but still remains, lets consumers and the financial system and a business ecosystem work smoothly. So we hope.
So two things I want to pull out of that. I mean, a lot to pick up on, but two things that really strike me as critical to highlight. One is the aspect of moving from intelligence sharing to disruption, right? And this is certainly our experience as well. We can do all sorts of private-to-private information sharing. We can also, do a lot of disruption purely on the private side, but ultimately we also need that public collaboration as well to come in and to be able to disrupt, which is key. The other thing you said that was also mentioned on the public side at the top, which I want to emphasize as well, is this idea to kind of reinforce the existing structures and platforms, right? I think sometimes we fall into a trap of like inventing something new, when actually what we need to do is maybe double down on what's already starting to show promise, and work through those existing frameworks. In our case, there's a lot of private to private on that side, but we heard earlier, references to the UNODC, to the IMF. These are equally important frameworks that we can work through mutual evaluation process and strengthen, to get us going to where we need to go. Rima, what's the perspective from your side at Meta? Your social media, what's working? What are some of the challenges?
Sure. So in terms of some of the pieces that are working, I was going to talk a little bit about the recognition around how much scams in their end-to-end operations cut across all of our sort of platforms and ecosystems. I think the speakers before me illustrated that very well. So I'll talk about what I think has been helpful in building action from that recognition. I think the acceleration of convening bodies like the Global Anti-Scam Alliance, the development of things like the GSC, like Jean-Jacques mentioned, and the focus from FATF, the engagement from the UN in bringing countries together at the Global Fraud Summit earlier this year. These are all really helpful in getting us to understand one another. So what is it that each of us see? What is it that each of us need to really be able to disrupt? I think the ability to be able to disrupt across the eco chain is really important. So we participated, for example, in a disruption effort with the FBI and the Department of Justice, as well as global law enforcement and industry sort of earlier this year. And what that allowed us to do from the Meta side was take down 1.4 million accounts. We also saw $3 million of crypto assets that were able to be frozen. You saw arrests of 63 suspects in this criminal activity as well. And I think the more we're able to coordinate and come together, the more we're able to actually attack these operations sort of across the chain. I think it's really important to think about how we're able to scale that. Which then brings me on to some of the challenges or things that I think we can work on. One is having harmonization across legal and regulatory frameworks, particularly at that sort of intersection of consumer protection, privacy, data protection, competition rules, really to eliminate ambiguities that may hinder some of the proactive action that we're taking, and we need sort of others to take along with us. And I think that coupled with protections for those who are acting in good faith will really enable more action in this space and more collaboration and signal sharing.
Yeah. So 100% agree. I mean, first of all, on the clarification perspective, we absolutely find that those supervisory bodies that are able to release, for example, frequently asked questions, these kinds of things, doesn't have to be some huge regulatory guidance document that takes a year to launch, right? It's kind of the tactical frequently asked questions. Here's the new scenario we're trying to test. Can we do it? Here are the reasons, and getting that comfort is really, really important. And then you mentioned another one for us in the financial services sector, which is key, which is ultimately safe harbor, which is when we're trying to, when we're acting in good faith, we should be rewarded for that and respected for that, and encouraged to take those chances. Again, in the context of fraud, to protect these victims. Nick, I'm going to go to you now. You're kind of our strategic eyes. You see across sectors. We've got our heads down, looking at the problem in front of us. You're there looking across the horizon. I know you've got some interesting initiatives, which we'll get into in a moment, but just hearing, the discussion over the last couple of minutes, and then, the valuable work that you're doing, what do you see as really the high utility types of information sharing across this ecosystem, social media, tech, financial services?
Thank you, Ned. So Nick Maxwell, I lead the Future of Financial Intelligence Sharing Research Program. We've just published ahead of the FATF plenary in June a survey of collaborative analytics platforms to tackle fraud, to really help us understand that question you've asked, Ned. Where are we now? What's active around the world? What's working? How is it working? So 37 platforms covered in the survey: public-private partnerships, private-to-private information sharing. I'm certain there are other platforms, perhaps on this call, that aren't in the survey, but it does cover a very large proportion of the community of anti-scam centers and platforms. And what we see is a mosaic of capabilities and experience and different practices around the world, a variety of different private sector involvement, a variety of use cases, from messaging to investigative use cases to warning functions to tracing and preventative use cases. These require different data points, and of course, different data points depending on where that anti-scam platform is in the business coverage and where it fits into the fraud attack chain. We surveyed these platform leaders on their views about the challenges to effectiveness, and they highlighted the top 4 challenges. The first being that the speed and diversity of domestic and cross-border payments was substantially increasing the threat profile. There's more choice, of course, and faster payments is good for commerce, but it comes with a fraud risk that needs to be thought about and mitigated against. The lack of cross-border sharing, the lack of certainty, the lack of clarity with regards to the boundaries of data protection law, and the lack of cross-sector information sharing, I think, are focus for us right now. Crucially, when it comes to that cross-sector information sharing, we see that upstream stakeholders have a lot of visibility on those initiation stages of a fraud attack, but it's downstream in when the money is stolen that perhaps the victims are making the report to financial stakeholders or to law enforcement. And we do not see enough cross-sector information sharing at the moment. There are some really interesting initiatives, but really this lack of cross-border information sharing, lack of cross-sector information sharing, or the opportunity for that to grow and the need for that to grow, very much evidenced by the survey. Obviously, there are great examples. Frontier Plus, led by the Singapore Police Force, a great example of anti-scam center connectivity with the law enforcement focus. Global Signal Exchange, a great example of cross-sector information sharing, but not yet, as Jean-Jacques has said, able to really make the most out of financial data sharing between upstream and downstream stakeholders.
Yeah, I completely agree that bridge of the collaboration between the financial services and the tech and the social media companies to be focused on the financial information itself. That would be a coup in this world. But I think to the points we've heard earlier, requires a lot of clarification and comfort from the right stakeholders, which we welcome. You talked about the mosaic of initiatives, 37 platforms. We've already heard Jean-Jacques, Justine, Rima, Jessica reference various initiatives in their remarks. Strikes me as a coordination challenge among many other challenges. We're close to time, and I want to make sure we end on time. And I respect the precedent that was set in the panel before us. I'd like to go kind of rapid fire. I'm going to start with Jean-Jacques, then Justine, then Nick, then Rima, then Jessica. I want you to focus in on the specific initiative you're working on and just give us kind of the 30-second, here's what we're trying to do, here's what it is. Remember that we've got a lot of people on the call who might not be in kind of the day-to-day on this. So giving me 30 seconds to 60 seconds on the initiative that you're particularly vested in. And that will help give everyone who's listening a good idea of the different pieces of the puzzle that we can potentially reinforce over the next 2 years through the FATF leadership. So Jean-Jacques, can you start us off, please?
Thanks, Ned. Look, as I mentioned, we've got this new project on disrupting scammers infrastructure, which we're doing within the context of the Global Anti-Scams Alliance, which a number of relevant organizations are already involved with, including several members of FATF. So it's a good meeting place. So the project is about disrupting physical, digital, but also financial infrastructures exploited by the scammers. We really need to join forces there. I think GAS has a good meeting point for that. But I think we really need, as others have said, to see how we can leverage what already exists in FATF to make it harder for the scammers to exploit the financial system. So I think if we can build bridges, if those interested should get in touch to get involved in that particular disruption project. I think we need to make sure we have a bridge between FATF and GASA and UN Summit, Interpol, who are all working on that. So yeah, I think let's just keep the channels of communication open, perhaps with GASA as a good meeting place. Thank you.
GASA, got it. Justine, let's go to you.
Yeah, okay. So at the end of last year, we developed the International Anti-Fraud and Technology Task Force, and that really brings together telecoms, social media, regulators, law enforcement, actually co-chaired by Giles, who opened today, and US Treasury, so co-chaired by UK and US Treasury. And really that initiative was really trying to galvanize the response to the seriousness of the fraud threat. So that is shaping everything that we're doing in terms of whether it's the whole training ecosystem, but also capacity building considerations and deep diving into thought leadership, the big issues. So we've got a paper coming out next week on data, on legal permissions. We've got a data toolkit coming out, really looking at the aspects around data integrity, what works best for others, how do FIs participate in anti-scam centers, all of these things. So it is a whole big initiative, and that is shaping a lot of our work. And I suppose the next big thing potentially maybe around looking at that cross-industry. How do we go to the cross-industry information sharing? And we have a number of initiatives underway there. I'll pause.
Awesome. Thanks, Justine, the task force. Let's go to Nick.
Thank you. Well, I think the good news is there is coordination. With Project Crosscurrent, which is a specific initiative looking at options to enhance cross-sector fraud risk information sharing to really deliver on the ambition that Rima, Jean-Jacques, Justine, and Ned, you've set out in this panel. So Wolfsburg Group, the Global Anti-Scam Alliance, Gaza Enforcement Working Group, the Financial Infrastructure Disruption Task Force, and we are partnered in association with ACAMS as well. Global Signal Exchange are engaged as a strategic partner for Project Crosscurrent. So all the partners are there. We will identify a range of options for enhanced cross-sector fraud risk information sharing, and with dialogue between these biggest financial stakeholders in the world and the biggest technology champions for integrity, really look at testing the impact of those leading options for financial data sharing and follow the money across sectors. So we'll be doing that in collaboration with the UK Online Crime Centre, National Economic Crime Centre.
Great, working through a lot of existing initiatives there, which is powerful. Rima, let's go to you.
Sure. So one existing initiative that we have actually goes back to the point that Nick made around, us as tech maybe seeing the interaction side, and then financial industry seeing the payment and getting the reports from people who have been harmed by a scam. So we have an initiative where the banks collect the information around what happened on our platform and share that back to us, and we also share information to financial industry. That enables us to sort of investigate, enforce, review at scale, and then build up our defenses. There was, I think Jessica mentioned at top, the challenge with bilateral agreements and how that doesn't enable scale. So one of the things that we've been doing as we've seen success with that program during the pilot is scaling it out globally using aggregators that have existing sort of data sharing agreements. So that's how we're able to really maximize on that. And we'll be looking to understand, how we can keep doing that and also apply that principle and learning across.
I like that. I like the fact that you've highlighted that idea of the banks also sharing back to social media. That's something that's easy for us to say, we want more from you, but there's a reciprocal altruism there that we need to engage in. That's fantastic. Jessica, 30 seconds on your IAF. You've got the ear of the C-suite. What are you guys working on?
Yeah, sure, Ned. And perhaps I'll close it out by just saying, as I said at the beginning, with respect to the importance of a network, there's a network of all of us working together. So all of these different groups that you're hearing from today that we talk to on a regular basis and are all working together to move various efforts forward. And that's what it's going to take. I think I'll leave it with the biggest question here is, what does good look like? And do we have in place what allows us to actually execute on what good looks like here from a deliberate capability? That's something that we're certainly trying to drill down on across our institutions around the world. And again, as Ned mentioned, we have the attention and the support of the C-suite. We have the board of directors. We have CEOs around the world focused here. That should make clear just how critical taking action is at this time now. So let's make use of that and let's count on that to move initiatives forward.
Fantastic. So we had a final question for everyone if there was time. There's not time, so I'm going to answer the final question for everyone. And that final question was, if you had one wish for the FATF roadmap, what would it be? And I would just say, in the spirit of what we've been hearing over the course of the last 30 minutes, one, don't underestimate the power of your convening authority. I think what you've heard more than anything else is that this is a challenge of coordination and deconfliction of effort. There's so many good things going on. We need to bring that together. And second, I would say every one of these initiatives requires a lot of resource and time and effort. And that's, again, my emphasis on the risk-based approach, the other pillar you talked about at the beginning, Giles Thompson, as one of the priorities. Risk-based approach for us, as we've made clear in the last couple of weeks through our renewed risk-based approach guidance, it's about allocation of resource and about prioritization of resource. And I think if we live through the spirit of the existing FATF principles and recommendations, we have kind of the right levers, as you well mentioned, to move forward here. Thank you so much, guys, for the quick round of private sector engagement. I'll hand it back to Shauna.
Thank you, Ned, and thank you all of panel 2. So I just was getting some questions in the Q&A about whether a recording will be available after the webinar, and the answer is yes. And now I'd just like to welcome Mina from the Humanity Research Consultancy to join me if she's there. And we're going to take a pause from a minute from talking about transactions and regulations and keep our minds on the human impact of what we're talking about. So Mina, if you're there, I want to ask you a first question about, when we're talking about the victims of scam compounds, who are we talking about?
Thank you so much, Shauna. Such a great question. First of all, we are talking about victims of modern slavery or human trafficking, or specifically under this umbrella, victims of forced criminality. So that is people who are being forced to be in front of a computer as a typist, or even for example as models, because lots of romance investment scam requires a model to actually talk to the scam victims. Sometimes we also see even victims being put on kind of positions as a security guard. So there are some survivors coming out saying that they were forced to perform violence to other people, tragically. There are also cases of victims of sex trafficking in the scam compounds, because it's important to understand when we talk about scam compounds, we are talking about essentially not just one single kind of building or location, but it's actually a kind of industrial park that kind of renting out offices or accommodation. Even they might have a swimming pool, they might have brothels in that case. So a lot of the time, unfortunately, there are also victims being taken into those locations to perform sex. And it's also important to remember, like when we talk about victims of human trafficking in the scam compound, we are really talking about kind of a spectrum. So not everyone is a perfect victim. Some of them, they might actually be willing scammers in the first place. They join the scam operation almost willingly. However, when they realize that they want to leave, this is really different. They realize it's not possible anymore to become victims of forced labor again, facing the same type of violence that the other victims are facing.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's, again, really important for us to keep in mind. And we just had a panel talking about the kinds of information sharing that we need to have and different types of information. Can you tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, the information that victims and NGOs working with victims can share and can help, law enforcement and others?
Yeah, of course, this is a great question. I will share with some actual examples. So a lot of survivors of human trafficking, they come out with such a passion to really try to stop the scam compounds and scam operation, because it is something that they, the darkest page in their life. So for example, there were survivors from East Africa that actually share the information of their traffickers, and that actually result in the arrest of their traffickers in Dubai, because lots of survivors of human trafficking from East Africa were trafficked through Middle East to Southeast Asia. So that's one thing. More than that, almost every single survivors are able to share the exact location for their scam compounds and scam operations. So they might be able to point out the kind of coordinations in Southeast Asia, in Middle East, sometimes even in East Africa. So for example, my team and I, we have mapped more than 300 scam compound locations across different continents. And those locations are extremely important because they actually can lead to arrest, crackdowns, or even sanctioning of the owners behind those scam compounds. Because if you kind of cross-check those casinos, you might be able to actually find the shareholders' information. So that's how, for example, the infamous case of the Prince Group or Chengzhi, you can tie them directly to the Jinbei compound, for example. The survivors of human trafficking can also share the exact type of scams that's utilized in the scam compound. So, for example, many people know about 杀猪盘 or the word pig butchering, which is problematic term, but anyway, it kind of talks about like a romantic investment scam. But the scam types in the compound is way more than that. There's also, for example, task scam, sextortion, sport gambling related type of scam. And these are the scam types that survivors are able to share with us. So you might tie it back to exactly how those scams are produced. Survivors can also share the exact type of scam methods are used in the compound. So, for example, I'm surprised nowadays, even when I talk to some intelligence companies or even law enforcement, they're still not aware of, they say, how the scammers might use malwares in introducing legitimate websites for the scam victims to be trapped in that situation. But I got those information from the survivors directly. So survivors have the wealth of knowledge, and I would very much say survivors could even suggest that different type of criminalities happening in those compounds. For example, there was one survivor from Southeast Asia telling me that he saw the compound owner visiting the compound with a tiger, and the compound owner claimed to be living in Singapore. How many people can we find in Singapore with a tiger? So I'm just saying, like, for example, there's also implication of wildlife trafficking in here, and also the indication of some significant individuals associated to the scam compound. So I would say, like, survivors has a wealth of knowledge, and I will also very much encourage tech companies or even law enforcement try to engage survivors because survivors, many of them, after coming out from the compound, they desperately really want the job opportunities or any kind of economic opportunity. So if they can be, positioned in places that actually can provide those expertise, it will be such a win-win situation.
Thank you, Minna. And just in the interest of time, the last question I have for you is, to help you in your work, if you could think of one thing that FATF could really do in the fight against fraud, what would it be?
Yeah, I would very much suggest to utilize the grey list tool on scam states, because unfortunately there are certain countries that are still very much sheltering and hosting majority of scam operations. So I will just give some examples in Southeast Asia that we know some countries that they were delisted in the last few years, but we will very much encourage the new leadership to revisit those decisions because the tools can be extremely powerful. It can also send a clear signal to other countries. They are starting to face more relocation of scam compound because criminals are expanding. They are expanding to different countries nowadays. So we would encourage the use of grey list as a tool because otherwise the new countries, they might not really realize the actual kind of cost and risk of hosting those scam operations. So that's my recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Minna, and thank you for being with us. So yes, I mean, you've just mentioned, I guess, one of the most impactful tools that the FATF has to impact change. I guess this comes at the end of a range of other tools that we have in the FATF and Global Network on evaluations, but it's just part of the broader conversation that we have about mobilizing our toolkit. So with that, I hand over now to the third panel and to Peggy, who will moderate that panel. Thank you, Minna.
Thank you, Shana.
Thank you very much, Shana, and hello, everyone. So panel 3 today will discuss how we can accelerate the tracing, freezing, and recovering of fraud proceeds. We will reflect on how current tools are working, how they might be strengthened, and how the FATF can help or incentivize more effective asset recovery. So before I begin, I'd just like to introduce myself and the panelists. I'm Peggy Pao. I'm head of the Singapore FATF delegation and director of Singapore's Commercial Affairs Department, which is responsible for money laundering and financial crime detection, investigation, and asset recovery. On the panel today, we have Bert Lo Chung Wong, Operations Coordinator at Interpol, who previously served in the Hong Kong Police Force, Paul Ketter from the Luxembourg Financial Intelligence Unit, who works closely with the Egmont Group of FIUs on rapid response programs, and Bruno Requial, Manager of Global Investigations at TRM Labs, a leading blockchain and analytics intelligence firm, and he has previously worked in the Brazilian Federal Police. So asset recovery is obviously a very rich topic, which we could spend hours discussing, but we will not, bearing in mind that today marks the beginning of a longer and deeper conversation as part of the FATF's work on fraud over the next 2 years. So I'll turn to our first question today, which is, what is making the real difference in the ability to accelerate tracing, freezing, and recovery of fraud proceeds on the ground? I'll turn to Bert from Interpol first, and just as some quick background, in 2023, the FATF worked closely with Interpol to strengthen global standards around asset recovery, covering the whole life cycle of asset recovery and emphasizing risk-driven, flexible and adaptable mechanisms to intervene before assets are dissipated or moved out of reach. The question before us today is, how are these standards actually being implemented on the ground? And we also have a related question from an audience member from the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Is collaboration between countries actually increasing in the face of increased risk? So over to you, Bert.
Thank you so much, Peggy, for having me in this panel, and it is my pleasure to be invited to share more about Interpol's toolkit in asset recovery. I'm coming from Interpol's Financial Crime and Anti-Corruption Center, and our mission is to reduce the harm and minimize the threat posed by financial crime. And mitigating the loss of scam victims by way of asset interception is one of our top priorities. Nowadays, it's so easy to transfer money from one account to another in split seconds, and even for overseas accounts. This transnational loophole enables scam syndicates to easily dispose their criminal gains simply by sending scam money overseas, and making victims harder to trace, giving them an easy way out to get off the hook. But this is where Interpol's work comes in handy, and we notice such modus operandi, and we act quick to introduce a global stop payment mechanism, which is called IGRIP, Interpol Global Rapid Intervention of Payments. This mechanism was introduced back in 2022 to create a global network of stop payment. And our objective is to bring in 196 member countries together to work collectively to stop transfer of victims' money and freeze the bank accounts involved so victims can take action to recover their loss, either by way of fund or recall or civil action. So how does IGRIP work? We line all our member countries together to form a 24/7 network, regardless time zone differences, and all our communications are made in security network. So when a victim in country A is deceived in a scam and transfer money to country B, he can report the case to his local police of country A, who will then make use of the IGRIP to inform the police in country B to take immediate action to contact the bank of receiving account and check if the money remains in the account, and if so, freeze the account for recovery action. And after IGRIP was introduced, it has been proved to be a highly successful mechanism in stop payment. We are able to add and assist our member countries intercepting payments for fund recall and freeze bank accounts, so victims can recover their loss. And to highlight some major cases, in last November, Hong Kong Police has assisted Australian Federal Police in intercepting 40 million loss of a business email compromise scam. And last month, we have just another successful interception of a $6.6 million from Singapore to Oman. And all these payments are timely intercepted and recovered. And these fine pieces of work shows the importance of bilateral cooperation, and also at the same time, the importance and effectiveness of IGRIP, which could facilitate such cooperation in asset interception. And we observe both there's an increasing in the usage rate and the successful interception rate under the IGRIP platform. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bert, for sharing the Interpol's work in this area. You mentioned a recent Singapore case, and Singapore can indeed personally attest to the usefulness of the IGRIP mechanism. There was an earlier case in which we managed to recover more than USD 39 million in a single case of business email compromise. So just a personal attestation to this effect. So let me bring in Paul next. In October 2023, the FATF actually published a report jointly with Interpol and the Egmont Group, which identified the key elements of a fit-for-purpose system to enable countries to effectively recover scam proceeds. So, Paul, over to you to share more.
Thank you, Peggy. Well, from a financial intelligence unit's perspective, the Egmont Rapid Response Program described in that report is designed precisely to address the issues you mentioned, Peggy, in your initial question, enabling the accelerated tracing and freezing of criminal proceeds. Very briefly, for those less familiar, the Egmont Group is a global organization connecting more than 180 FIUs worldwide, enabling secure, direct, and rapid information exchange across borders. And this is absolutely key, because what makes the difference, the real difference on the ground is, and we already mentioned it, speed, coordination, and the ability to act immediately. Fraud, especially cyber-enabled fraud, moves extremely fast. And as other speakers already mentioned, we know that recovery rates drop dramatically after 48 to 72 hours. So the approach with this rapid response program is straightforward. Make sure that among FIUs, the right information reaches the right counterparts immediately, using standardized procedures and templates. Not too much information, not too little, but exactly what is needed to trace the proceeds. The swift tracing of assets can then lead to the freezing of those assets, directly or indirectly, which is another decisive role played by FIUs. Let me briefly illustrate this with an example where proceeds were transferred from a bank to another bank in another jurisdiction, and then to a crypto asset service provider in the third jurisdiction, where part of the funds were converted into crypto. Well, within a few days, we were able to trace the funds and at least partially freeze both fiat and crypto. And why did this work? Well, first, because in this example, banks and crypto asset service providers fulfilled their role as obliged entities. Second, because FIUs were able to swiftly exchange information and trace the funds. And finally, because the FIUs involved had the legal powers to freeze assets without delay, preventing the funds from disappearing and thus enabling judicial authorities to recover the funds. Thank you, Peggy.
Thank you very much, Paul. You gave an example where illicit funds were converted to cryptocurrency. I think that's quite timely. Many of us would know about the use of virtual assets channels to funnel fraud proceeds. So now let me bring in Bruno to comment on asset recovery when it comes to virtual assets.
Thank you, Peggy. Well, at TRM Labs, our mission is to build a safer world through technology and data, and everything I'm about to describe flows from that. The tools we've heard about are generally effective, but they usually operate on fiat rails. Some rely on correspondent banking relationships, on a bank at the other end that can act. But when fraud proceeds move into crypto, many of the standard infrastructure does not apply. Crypto is borderless by design. A transaction confirmed in Brazil is settled in Singapore in seconds. There is no bank to call, no message to stop. That's the gap that TRM wants to fill with the T3 Financial Crime Unit and the Beacon Network. These are more than a public-private partnership. It's public-private disruption. T3 brings together TRM Labs, Tether, and Tron to support law enforcement investigative efforts. When a freeze request comes in, our partners can act directly on chain at the protocol level in real time. Beacon Network is the largest public-private partnership in crypto, covering 75% of global crypto volume, enabling real-time coordination between law enforcement and financial institutions to freeze illicit funds before cash out. This is where T3 and Beacon close a full circle. T3 handles the freeze in unhosted wallets. Beacon immediately propagates the intelligence to VASPs globally, from freeze to propagation end to end. The results, over $500 million frozen across multiple blockchains and over 20 jurisdictions worldwide. Response time down from days to hours, sometimes even minutes. Cases where funds were frozen even before the victim filed a formal report. Cross-border, real-time, public-private disruption. That's what's new.
Great, thank you so much to all the speakers. So we've heard about the police to police as well as FIU to FIU and public-private mechanisms for asset recovery. I'd like to ask a follow-up question to the panelists. Do we think these tools are being fully optimized? Are there other tools that we need? And what can the FATF do to help in this area? Maybe I'll start off with Paul for this round of questions.
Yes, thank you, Peggy, for these follow-up questions. Very briefly on the question, are the tools fully exploited? Let's say they are increasingly used when it comes to the rapid response program. But of course, there's always room for improvement. I think what is needed is awareness raising, regularly updating procedures. All this is very important. Having the right tools is one thing, using them consistently and correctly is another. We also need to make sure that FIUs have the right powers. I already referred to freezing powers, and that they work in close cooperation with obliged entities, law enforcement, and judicial authorities. Very briefly on freezing powers in Luxembourg, for instance, we benefit from very extensive freezing powers. These enable us to act swiftly, to freeze any type of assets, including crypto, and for a sufficient period of time. So to allow judicial authorities to recover the funds when necessary through formal international cooperation. When it comes to what else can be done, I think, and this was already mentioned by other panelists, I think we need to move beyond a purely bilateral exchange and enhance multilateral information sharing. In practical terms, this means being able to share operational information with several counterparts at the same time, and later on to conduct joint analysis between authorities. This can take various forms: public-private partnerships, public-public, private-private, and all this, of course, needs a clear and secure framework. But this is clearly the way forward, and I think the AML. The EU AML package provides quite useful examples in this respect. Ultimately, if we want to keep pace, we need to work closely together, even more efficiently. Criminals are increasingly organized using new technologies, including AI, operating in structured networks and through what we see more and more, crime as a service. So we must adapt to that reality with faster action, stronger powers, and clearly with even more multilateral cooperation. Thank you. Back to you, Peggy.
Great insights there. Thank you, Paul. I'd like to move to Bert, maybe. Can Bert jump in on this question, please?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Like Paul said, there's always room for improvement. And what Interpol is doing is to form a global defense against scam and fraud and enhance the effectiveness of our iGrip to stop payment mechanism. We need to have a higher usage rate and adoption rate by our member countries to get rid of potential geographic loopholes. So we have to continue to raise the awareness and promote this useful tool to our law enforcement partners. And so our stop payment network can be wider and have a better coverage. And at the same time, we are also actively promoting the concept of our anti-scam center, which was previously mentioned by other speakers. So all our member countries can have a coordinated and effective response against fraud. And I must highlight that the success of iGrip lies upon the support from our member countries. And to maximize the effectiveness of our stop payment mechanism, we need our member countries to have an instant and round-the-clock communication channel with us, so they can send and process requests from other members without delay. And a designated 24/7 point of contact in such anti-scam center model will help. And on top of that, we will need them to have a good banking infrastructure in place to support this stop payment mechanism. This includes a timely and designated communication channel with their local banks for timely exchange of information. And they will also need relevant legislations and administrative measures empowering them to initiate account freezing action in a timely manner without delay. We know that some of our law enforcement partners, they do have difficulties in exchanging information with their local banks and has no authority to initiate any stop payment requests. So in dealing with such complex crime like scam and fraud, so highly organized, we need to have a standardized model to be adopted. And I believe that FATF will play a crucial role in this regard to help us to enlist support from the regulators, so the law enforcement and the banking sector, they can work closer and from a better network, how we can stop the payment more effectively. And last but not least, to facilitate our member countries in establishing an anti-scam center, Interpol has prepared a set of guidelines on how to set up an anti-scam center. And it contains information such as the core functions of anti-scam center and our proposal structure covering case reporting, coordination, asset interception, and public-private partnership. Back to you, Peggy. Thank you.
That's great, Bert. And I'd like to pick up on your point on the importance of anti-scam centers and connect it back to Paul's point on the need to work multilaterally. In Singapore's context, we've found that connecting anti-scam center to anti-scam center mutually has been powerful and effective. You would be familiar with Frontier Plus. I think it was mentioned earlier as well. It's a multilateral alliance of anti-scam centers, which was founded by Singapore, linking 14 anti-scam units across the globe. I can cite that 2 joint operations conducted through Frontier Plus resulted in approximately 28.2 Sing dollars seized from over 36,000 frozen bank accounts in 7 jurisdictions. So just an example to illustrate the importance of the points that both of you have raised. Thanks. So now I will move to Bruno.
Thanks again, Peggy. Let me be direct. We're seeing scams and fraud at an unprecedented speed and scale. Over the last year, we've seen a 500% increase in AI-enabled scams. That is scary, to say the least. Based on that, here are a few blind spots that I want to name. The first one is restitution. The industry has gotten good at freezing. Getting money back to victims is still slow and legally inconsistent across jurisdictions. So FATF could help jurisdictions make victim restitution a first-class outcome in VASP supervision, not an afterthought. The second one is adoption symmetry. Many VASPs cooperate quickly and well, parts of the ecosystem don't. Standard exists on paper, enforcement coverage remains uneven. Now on what FATF can do, help jurisdictions standardize freeze and reissuance procedures, encourage anti-scam center model to incorporate a crypto-specific rapid response layer, and connect those centers to public-private disruption networks like T3 and B. And critically, provide clarity and guardrails for AI adoption by law enforcement and crime-fighting partners like ourselves operating within public-private disruption frameworks. AI is already on the attacker side. Our partners need the legal and regulatory clarity to deploy it on ours. The technology exists. Disruption models like T3 and Beacon are working. Now we must scale it, and we look forward to engaging with FATF on this critical mission.
Great. Thank you very much to all the speakers. I think it's been really insightful responses to the questions. So in the interest of time, I'll just wrap up some of the key takeaways from today's panel 3, which I think also draw on some of the threads that have already started to emerge from the earlier panel sessions. So firstly, I think just to immediately follow up on what Bruno has said and what Ned also alluded to in panel 2, I think it's clear that we have some existing powers and some useful mechanisms. And these are current, we already have them. So it's a question about increasing awareness, making sure that we promote and encourage a more consistent use globally. I think a second point that has also come out through our discussions, we reinforced the earlier panel discussions on the importance of public-private partnerships, particularly in asset recovery. Collaboration on all 3 levels would be really important: public to public, public to private, and as earlier mentioned as well, private to private. We all have a strong role to play in this area. So a question to ask could be how the FATF will continue to effectively incentivize and support such partnerships In particular, how we can encourage even more multilateral, not just bilateral, cross-border, as well as cross-sector and cross-domain, not just information sharing, but actual operational coordination to effectively stop money flows in a speedy and timely manner. On the last area that has emerged, the importance of technology. Technology does present a challenge to asset recovery, particularly due to the use of virtual assets and networks. We know that the FATF regularly reviews countries' progress on regulating virtual asset services, but we also know that there is much more to do, as highlighted by Bruno. It's also clear from today's discussion that technology not only provides opportunities, but it is absolutely essential to harness for successful asset recovery, particularly in the virtual assets realm. So can technology help us to coordinate better across borders? This is something that has been explored at the G20 Tech Sprint, and is something that FATF could also explore. So much exciting work to look forward to ahead, and we hope that you've all found this session helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peggy, and all of panel 3. So we're just 5 minutes behind, still pretty good. And I'll hand over now to Violaine for panel 4.
Thank you very much, Shanna. So I will ask my 6 speakers to be quick and sharp so that we can stick to the timeline. And I think it's also coherent with the fact that we want to provide a quick and fast, sharp answer to this global threat. So this is a rapid fire round, this fourth panel. The aim is to illustrate how our global network is already mobilized and in action to combat this global threat. That's the first goal. And the second one is to understand what other organizations are doing and how they can contribute together to building a coherent system against fraud. So I will start with my colleague from the FATF style regional bodies. So I have Melissa from Asia Pacific, I have Esteban from Latin America, I have Suleiman from Middle East and North Africa. And I will ask you 3 questions, which is first, if you can, in very short terms, illustrate an initiative you have worked on that support the broader global network effort on fraud, one gap that you see, and one ask to the FATF. And for that, I will start with Melissa. Melissa, over to you.
Thanks, Violaine. So one of the initiatives that the APG has recently completed has been a typologies report on cyber scam hubs and human trafficking that looked predominantly at cyber scam hubs that we saw in the Southeast Asia region, but we do also see moving to other parts of the world. The report focused on the illicit financial flows associated both with the scam proceeds as well as the trafficking of individuals for forced criminality. The report identified some challenges, particularly around some of the issues which we've discussed already in this event around information sharing and the ability to respond quickly to reports of scams and fraud. The report also identified some best practices, including some of the anti-scam centres that we've also spoken about, as well as some areas for further exploration. The report also contains some red flag indicators, which we hope will be useful in supporting public-private partnerships in combating fraud and also the associated human trafficking. One of the gaps that we do see coming out of this research has been better understanding the evolution of these cyber scam hubs, particularly through decentralization and dissipation, including through the use of emerging technologies such as AI. We've seen globally some concerted law enforcement efforts that have had some success in dismantling these hubs, only for them to reappear in different forms in different parts of the world. So we need to better understand and catch up with this evolution so that we can understand how the organised criminal syndicates behind these cyber scam hubs are concealing their operations and attempting to avoid scrutiny so that we're not just moving one problem from one area to another. And I think in relation to those gaps and the research that we've conducted as well, one ask to the FATF, and it's hard to narrow it down to just one, but I think the highest priority would really be to strongly encourage FATF members to share their expertise and to work hand in hand with members of the global network to combat these scams and frauds. It needs to be more than just pointing out the deficiencies or where things aren't going well, moving more towards working shoulder to shoulder, sharing expertise, and helping jurisdictions to do the best that they can to stop these operations from occurring, but also to successfully identify, trace, and recover the proceeds. We know that many victims of scams are located in FATF jurisdictions, but also that many of the proceeds end up in these jurisdictions. And what we hear from our members is that they want to work closely with regional and international partners, including those in the FATF. And we really need all parties to really come willingly to work together to share expertise, information as a really concerted global effort against these crimes. Thanks, Phelan.
Thank you, Melissa. So we lost Latin America. We lost Esteban. So I move to Suleiman. Thank you, Suleiman, for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Violin, and thank you for this invitation to take part in the launch of this important initiative. So MENA FATF has a number of working groups, such as the Risk Committee and the FIU Forum, which allows members to share experience between each other on the latest threats, risks, and solutions to frauds in the region. Again, fraud in the region shares many similar traits, but we also have some unique circumstances in the region. I think one of them is the digitization of governments for convenience and speed, but this also creates opportunities for attackers. What we've also seen governments do is creating cybercrime authorities to defend the critical national infrastructure and to manage cyber incidents. MENA FATF are also working on a regional risk analysis report, which kind of identifies the regional risk, which of course includes fraud, and it'll be interesting to see the outcomes of this report. Another uniqueness, I think, of the region is the geopolitics of it, and it's not confined to the physical world. It extends to the digital ecosystem, where criminals exploit uncertainty, confusion, and urgency to launch fraudulent campaigns. For instance, we find that fraudsters use fraudulent emergency registration forms to qualify for government support or assistance and to send those to whether it's residents or citizens. We also find newly registered websites that appear to offer evacuation services focusing on sensitivity, discretion, and confidentiality for security purposes. And also, in times of crisis, we see both individuals and businesses become more vulnerable to having their goods delivered. So fraudsters present fabricated parcel tracking portals, claiming shipment placed on hold due to the regional instability and asking for clearance evacuation fees and personal details. So if governments don't have already the right tools to deal with fraud in normal circumstances, it becomes even a bigger vulnerability during times of crisis. I think a few things FATF can do. I think one, we're nearing around 25% of the current round of mutual evaluations. I think extracting how the members of the global network are implementing the FATF toolkit on fraud, what works, what doesn't work, best practices, and also maybe thinking about something like we did on the virtual asset contact group, something related to fraud to kind of track what countries are doing, because as many speakers have mentioned, fraud has been increasing exponentially in the past few years. Thank you, Viola.
Thank you, Suleiman. Thank you, Suleiman and Melissa. And I know that in Gavilat, they are working on AI and the use, but also abuse of AI in the context of fraud. So I think this illustrates, how having, 9 FSRBs, 9 FATF-style regional bodies can help the FATF in coordination with other international organizations to move forward collectively and to provide a global answer to a global threat. I see Esteban back, so I will give the floor to Esteban. Happy to see you back, Esteban. The floor is yours.
Yes, sorry for that. I have some issues with my connection. No, I just wanna say from GAFILAT, from the Latin American a region that were really interested in developing more on fighting fraud. The fraud is an issue that's been actually developing a lot in Latin America. In Latin America, we have every 2 years we do a threat assessment of which are the threats that are actually being developed in Latin America, and threat has been rising a lot in the region. It came from a emerging threat in the beginning, and right now is a serious problem that not only lost a lot of money, a lot of funds, but also has a deep social impact in the region. So we are really eager to support FATF in this work to build up in the global network a better response with this, and we're thinking on developing our next typology exercise that was going to be something regional in developing a global response to fraud, inviting all countries. That was gonna be in March next year, and we will be happy to have a lot of countries, a lot of regions. We are ready to support the coming of many regions in order to build up this response from Latin America. That said, although we are developing this in Latin America, I think that there's still need for FATF to lead this response, to give us some information on how fraud is working outside our region. I think that fraud is something that although might have some impacts regionally, is developed globally, and also has a special way to be shared within criminals from every region. So for us, it's key that FATF has this global response to the issue from the world to the different regions, including Latin America. That's what I have to say, and I hoping that FATF again with this presidency leads the way on giving us the responses that we need to tackle back this big problem that we have in our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esteban. I think without further ado, I will turn to international organizations, which are also in action and involved in the fight against fraud. So I will start with Laurie from the Global Privacy Assembly. Thank you for being with us today, Laurie. I think you heard, previous panelists mentioning the point on the challenge related to data protection and privacy. It's an important part of the discussion, and we are glad that you can join us today. So can you tell us about an initiative that is ongoing currently at the Global Privacy Assembly? And the second aspect of my question would be, how do you see coordination, engagement with the FATF to advance the fight against fraud? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Absolutely happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I will keep it sharp and brief as requested, but please do let me know if you have questions along the way. So I'm Laurie Baker. I work for the Dubai International Financial Center, and I chair the working group for the Global Privacy Assembly on data sharing for the public good. Just a very brief background of that working group. It started out as the COVID-19 task force. We spent some time in our early years, even after it changed to the data sharing for public good working group, to look at health data sharing in critical situations, emergencies, and so on, and took a lot of that learning over to what we are now looking into, which is AML, CFT, data sharing for prevention of financial crime, prevention of fraud, and so on, and the intersection between data protection principles, requirements, rights of the individual, and obviously the requirement to prevent financial crime. This goes back a few years now. I believe it was the 2024 Global Privacy Assembly in Jersey, where we had a panel with the head of FATF joining us to also discuss these issues. So we've been collaborating to some degree, not in each other's lives every day, but we have had this partnership between Global Privacy Assembly and FATF for a few years now. And so Bradley Tasso, who is in the regulator's office, the data protection regulator's office in Gibraltar, came to me with this initiative to try and really drill down into this question, which came up as part of the panel in 2024. Some of you may have been there, maybe remember. I know there's some overlap in data protection attendees of these things anyway. But I'll just read out very briefly that this global initiative will examine the intersection of data protection and anti-money laundering financing frameworks with a focus on data sharing and an objective of promoting clarity, consistency, and trusted data sharing practices that uphold individuals' rights while strengthening action against financial crime. So we're working on a work program now for 2026-2027, including research, expert engagement, and guidance development. This is where, working with you all comes in. We want to make sure that we reflect in this work real-world challenges, practical experience, and engaging with stakeholders and other public authorities, regulated sectors, industry groups, and so on. So really, that's an overview of what we're doing. There's a number of data protection authorities committed to this, and if you kind of hear the list, some of them make absolute sense in that they are very much financial center related. So Abu Dhabi Global Market, ourselves, Gibraltar, Guernsey, Isle of Man, even Switzerland. So there's quite a few data protection authorities that grapple with these questions on a regular basis. And we could only benefit from getting that additional insight from organizations like FATF, from this launched forum and so on about preventing fraud. And please do let us know, reach out to myself, reach out to Bradley, whether or not you'd like to contribute, participate, collaborate. We are looking at providing webinars, again, doing some practical research experience and maybe doing a few surveys. So we would welcome the opportunity to work together.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I think it's important for the audience to hear that. And I think it's important for us at working level. We have already engaged and we'll continue to engage with you. And it's very good to know that you will be part of that journey. So I'm turning now to Ben from the IMF. The World Bank and IMF are developing the Bangkok Blueprint. Could you tell us what the objective of this blueprint is? And my second question for you is, if you have one job to tax the FATF with, what will it be? Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Violen. So as you know, this issue, fraud in digital services, has been a topic of discussion at recent IMF spring and annual meetings because of the impact that it's having on IMF members. And in coordination with the authorities in Thailand, who are hosting our 2026 annual meetings in Bangkok later this year, IMF and World Bank staff were tasked with drafting a paper specifically aimed at discussing this in more detail and looking at how countries should address this issue in particular. And the paper, which we're calling for short the Bangkok Blueprint, sets out a number of high-level considerations for national authorities, so policymakers, supervisors, law enforcement agencies, to really think about when designing and implementing measures to address this issue and to tackle cyber-enabled fraud. The key considerations, they cover a range of areas such as consumer protection, cybersecurity, the need for cross-sector collaboration. So all of the different areas of this kind of anti-fraud ecosystem really that need to come together to sort of tackle this growing threat that we keep hearing about is growing exponentially, particularly given advances in technology such as AI. But importantly for us and for this forum, the paper highlights the need to leverage the AML-CFT framework. And again, for all the reasons that we've really discussed today and we've heard about from the different sort of stakeholders and people participating. And from our perspective, we see effective AML-CFT frameworks as really key to protecting financial integrity and specifically in this context, addressing fraud. You asked about an ask for the FATF. The paper's not really designed for that. So in that regard, we don't have a specific ask for the FATF. It's more a kind of nudge to countries and a guide and a tool, if you like, for countries to address this issue. But it does remind countries of the need for a robust AML framework to help fight cyber-enabled fraud. So in other words, it kind of stresses the need to implement the FATF standards effectively. It does also seek to highlight the work that the FATF is doing. So the stuff that we've been talking about today in terms of examining how the toolkit can be applied more effectively to address fraud. And in particular, it stresses that the FATF is using its convening powers to bring together a range of different stakeholders, such as technology companies, social media platforms, financial institutions. And we heard how important this was today, particularly I think Ned in panel 2 mentioned this, that this shouldn't be underestimated. And I think it's really important because what we've heard today is there are a number of different actors in this space that can help address this particular issue. And there is a need for a vehicle to bring these together to look at this in more detail. And I think the other thing we've also heard is obviously there's a real commitment by different partners and different entities involved in this area to get together and continue to work on addressing this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And it's a good segue to our dear colleague Lara, who is the last one to take the floor. The pressure on you, Lara. I'm sorry for that, but very happy that you're on board today. So the FSB and CPMI, BIS, but you represent the FSB today, have done a lot of work under the cross-border payment roadmap. The FATF is part of this roadmap for the part which is related to payment transparency. So what would you like to tell the audience about what the FSB is aiming at doing, and what would you ask the FATF to do in this area? Thank you, Lara.
Thank you, Violaine. 2 quick points. Firstly, as part of the FSB's work on the cross-border payments roadmap, a number of data frictions from data frameworks were identified. In 2024, the FSB issued a set of recommendations for authorities and international organisations to undertake to promote alignment and interoperability across data frameworks for cross-border payments without compromising on the objectives underlying AML, CFT, sanctions, and data protection and privacy rules. Several of these recommendations are specified in our report as being applicable to preventing fraud. So next year, the FSB will conduct a thematic peer review to understand national authorities' implementation of these recommendations. Second point, we are already looking beyond the end of this cross-border payments roadmap that ends in 2027. So our ask of FATF, it will be important next year that we understand very well FATF's vision for how it will follow up recommendation 16 and tackle fraud, and how this should feature in the next cross-border payments roadmap. Thank you, Violaine.
Thank you, Lara. Fast and sharp. Thank you very much. Very clear. So I will invite Giles to make closing remarks. What I just want to say before, thank you very much for my panelists, because we had not a lot of time, but you were quick, sharp, and I think you illustrate the fact that we need a global approach, that we have a global network which is already in action, and that matters a lot, and that's how we will be effective in providing and promoting a global approach. That with other international organizations, I think we will be able, to coordinate and to work together to join our efforts so that we have a comprehensive approach and be able to take into account data protection, security of payment, and also some things that we didn't have time to discuss today, but the point related to technical assistance that will also help some countries make being better and doing better in this area. So I now hand over to Giles. Thank you very much to my panelists, and see you very soon, all of you. Bye. So Giles, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Violaine, and thank you to all our speakers for participating at all times of the day in your countries and keeping your remarks so focused and brief. Just some brief takeaways for me, and then what happens next. Takeaways, clearly we heard a lot of high-level commitment from governments and C-suites of business to the fight against fraud. I think that will be necessary but not sufficient for making a bigger dent in fraud. And I think it's also fair to say, we don't yet have that high-level buy-in from all members, all countries, and all parts of the sector that we need. And we see a role for our presidency of the FATF, as well as the G20, the G7, and the Financial Stability Board over the next 2 years to try and improve that global buy-in to these goals. Second point, I think there is clearly a lot of nascent, promising initiatives going on that we need to be careful not to duplicate or repeat. But there's also a key coordination challenge that the FATF can play a role in as a convener of its global network and all its partners to bring these initiatives together, try and coordinate them, and identify what is working and help scale it across borders and across other countries. Thirdly, a need for speed. We've heard a lot about how we need to get upstream and react faster to tackle fraud. It's a great enabler to have faster payments, but also presents more of a challenge. And that's going to cause some issues. I think, we're going to need to think about what it means for our traditional financial intelligence system. And I'm pleased to say that in the risk-based approach priority for the UK presidency, we will be doing a report on the future of the financial intelligence system that will examine just this point. Do we need to adapt and evolve our financial intelligence model, the standards the FATF has, to reflect the way that the world is moving in order to tackle threats such as fraud? I think then where FATF can best focus its effort to scale what is working and improve it and tackle barriers. Clearly, information sharing came out as an important issue for every panel, virtually every speaker. Not information sharing for the sake of it, but for a purpose, and the purpose being to disrupt crime, especially fraud. So we need to really focus on what we can do at an FATF level, and that will be a complementary priority for the UK presidency, where we will be pushing for global adoption by the FATF of a standard requiring information sharing for real-world outcomes for disruption. And we will be also working to try and identify, break down the barriers to cross-border sharing of information and private-to-private sharing of information, where we heard a lot about the need to go beyond the traditional AML, CTF regulated sector to bring in information from tech, telco, social media sectors, virtual assets, as well as a regulated sector, in order to have the full picture and get that access quicker. And get that information quicker in order to achieve results and disruption. I think there's clearly a key role that we will look at for the FATF in trying to address a common theme, which was, we are sharing information, but not at the scale that's needed, and it's still very broken down into silos. So how do we break down those silos? How do we create greater legal and regulatory certainty for the safe and faster sharing of information? I think that links very well to another element of the risk-based approach priority for the UK presidency that Ned and others brought up, which is to do this, we need to also incentivize the private sector to participate in these initiatives. Where these initiatives are essentially voluntary and discretionary, in order to, at scale, have the participation we need from the private sector, we need to also ensure that supervisors and regulators are recognizing and incentivizing participation in these sorts of initiatives that provide useful, valuable intelligence and outcomes to law enforcement, and ensure that supervision is aligned with those priorities and not diverting resource into low-value activity that's not yielding sufficient outcomes. And then asset recovery. We heard a lot about how FATF has strong standards on asset recovery, but we need to think about how they need to adapt and move quicker. So the powers through the new FATF standards on freezing quickly, freezing at request of international counterparts, the role of the iGrip tool from Interpol as well, and a lot more we can do also through our existing standards on virtual asset regulation and supervision to help prevent what is quite often a loophole or a weak spot for us in terms of virtual assets being the mechanism of choice for scams and for the laundering of the proceeds. So to wrap up, what happens next? So clear message that FATF should focus in the first instance on the tools it has and using those better, not reinventing the wheel. And that needs to be the full range of our evaluations, our follow-up, our policy work, our standards, and all of it. As Shana said, we will start quickly between now and October of reaching out to you all, working with you all to bring together the existing work that we know is out there on the threat, the typologies, the global picture of scams represented in particular through scam compounds. But we will very quickly then move on in a second stage to look at what is working well, best practices, and how we can scale those. And then the intention is to come out quite rapidly for us between now and February with recommendations about where the FATF can go further and what more we can do using our existing FATF toolkit. And we're going to try and use the convening power that 2 or 3 speakers mentioned to facilitate this work. Reach out to us. We'll be reaching out to you about how you can all be involved in this work. We will form a private sector consultative group to help guide the FATF project team working on all of this. And the aim is to work towards a large event that we will host in the spring of next year called the Global Response Against Fraud, building on the Global Fraud Summit and the big fire events that the Singapore presidency of FATF did a couple of years ago, to bring together public and private sectors to take stock of the work we've done to date, what's working amongst all these initiatives that have been happening and that people have spoken about, and where we can best collectively focus our time and effort over the next 2 years to deliver better results. So I wanted to thank everyone today for all their participation, for the insights they've shared. It was fantastic to have every continent of the world, all parts of the global network, so many of our partners and observers speaking about what they're doing and the impact they're starting to have, and about how we can work together to scale that. We know we need to step up our work quickly because the scale of the threat and the need for a response demands it. And we will do that in coordination with you all, not duplicating, but complementing and trying to really identify where we in the FATF can add most value to all of our efforts. So I will leave it there. I thank you very much for your attention and your support in the 2 years ahead. And we look forward to continuing the work. Thank you very much.